block of issues. The question of regulation, cybersecurity, taxation, and other related matter. Mr. Maciek Laskus, founder and chief executive officer of Safari, Poland.
Thank you very much. After this announcement, I feel like I was going to a UFC fight, so it feels much safer as an environment. I was sitting here and listening to the previous speakers, and I was increasingly feeling that I really don't fit the picture of the talks in this block, because everybody was trying to show the direction towards how blockchain could be useful for the governments, or how can we direct the regulation towards the adoption, whereas I believe that this is not the goal. The goal is not to make blockchain useful for the nation states and the governments. The goal is to replace them, get rid of them, because they're all an outdated structure. So what we need to do is effectively treat the governments and nation states the same way as Uber treated the taxi industry. Take this old, inefficient system, take it apart, keep the small parts that are useful, and put it into a new system. And therefore, the objective is to replace it, not to adopt to it. So being compliant with regulation is a useful short-term objective, because it's kind of convenient that I'm not going to get dragged to prison after this talk. But it's definitely not the goal. We have an opportunity to redesign our society from scratch. We can get rid of all of these, or most of these inefficiencies and things that we all complain about. And decentralized money is just the first step. There's way more than we can do. And one of these essential elements of the new decentralized infrastructure is identity. We cannot really build a decentralized world without a decentralized identity. And in order to justify that statement, we have to dive in a little bit into what identity is. Has any of you ever actually asked yourself, what is identity? What does it mean that I have an identity? I mean, your name or your ID card is not your identity. So is not your face or body. Your identity is the collective perception of who you are in every context by the people you're interacting with. Which means you don't really have one identity. None of us has one identity. I have an identity here, and I have an identity tomorrow when I meet my friends back home, and I have an identity at the office and at hundreds and hundreds of other locations. But what ties all of these different identities that I create is my name, my legal name, the documents that the country I come from issued. And these identifiers are really what controls all of these identities, that pull together all of my identities and control me to a large extent. Which means that the state, which issues these identifiers, really has an overwhelming control over my life. That's not good. We should replace that system with a decentralized identity system where I can control the identifiers that define my identity. But there's a problem with that. We want to create a decentralized identity system. At least many of us in the industry do. But none of the designs so far is in any way sufficient. So there are three fundamental requirements that you would want from such a system. So first one is that it needs to be privacy preserving. Meaning that in order to create this identifier, to use this identity system, you need not to be obligated to relinquish any other identity. Because otherwise, it's all pointless. If you have to use another identity, it's still the same identity. The second thing is that it needs to be self-sovereign, meaning that I can issue my identifiers. I can control my identifiers. Not the state, not any other third party. And I can do whatever I want with them, because it's my identity. And finally, we need scarcity in the system. Because without scarcity, the system is useless. We already have systems that are not scarce. Everybody can go to Twitter or Reddit or set up an email account, and these are identifiers, but there's not an identity system that you could use because there's no scarcity, there's no skin in the game. And all of the systems that are there so far fulfill only 2 out of 3 of these criteria, at best. Usually, they don't even get 2 out of 3. I refer to this as decentralized identity trilemma, meaning that the problem is that these features are usually self-exclusionary, meaning that you can introduce scarcity into the system by forcing people to have a going through KYC process and proving that you have an ID. But then it's not privacy preserving because you're relinquishing your ID that's actually nested still in the nation-state infrastructure. And second, it's not really self-sovereign because still you're only allowed to do that because you're relying on this ID that's issued by the state. So that solution doesn't work. On the flip side, if we have a self-sovereign system that's privacy preserving, and there are solutions that allow that, there is no source of scarcity, which means that we cannot really use that for really cool applications like voting or governance, because everybody can create 100,000, 10,000 identities, and they have 10,000 votes. That does not work. So we really have to solve that trilemma in order to progress further, but that's a really hard problem. And here you have an example of some of the most popular ID systems or digital identity systems, and as you can see, none of them fulfills that requirement. I believe that in order to solve the problem, we have to find something I usually refer to as scarcity of human. So what proof of work really has done is that it created an abstraction of financial capital in the form of a metric. So really, it reduced all of this complexity of our world and what we express as financial capital to a series of numbers that price in the cost of arithmetic operations. That's all that it is. And through that cost of arithmetic operation, we can extrapolate to what the cost of financial capital is. And that introduces scarcity into decentralized systems. And all of the things that have been possible so far really stem from that discovery. We need that for human capital. So today, the scarcity in our identity systems based on nation-state infrastructure are nested in the scarcity of identifiers, meaning that you are born, you are a single human, which can be fairly easily identified, like verified by other humans, and then you're assigned a number, you're assigned a name, and you get your documents, and these documents are like you have one. So there is scarcity to that. That's very useful. Alternative to that is the scarcity of humans. So in other words, what I mentioned at the beginning, that you have an identity in every context that you interact with other humans, well, that's effectively what the scarcity of human would entail, that you would quantify somehow these interactions, this awareness of you in other people's brains, and translate it into a metric. So quantifying what we usually refer to as social capital, this perception of us in other people's minds, can allow us to measure human capital. Measuring human capital is an immensely difficult problem. Quantifying social capital is a very hard problem, but way easier than tackling human capital. So human capital, just as a quick recap, is an ability to make, like we express our ability to make contributions to the society. That would be probably the simplest definition I can come up with. Whereas the social capital is the value of these contributions as perceived by others in the society, if that makes sense. Okay? So by that token, we cannot get ultimately precise metric for human capital, but we can quantify the approximation of our human capitals as perceived by others. We just have to get lots and lots and lots of data. So the problem is the data. And I believe that this problem is solvable. And the reason I feel confident saying that is that for the last 12 months, we've been experimenting with an algorithm that actually quantifies the perception of you in other people's heads. And we've built a second-order metric that pulled data for now just from Twitter and quantified these interactions in all of these different contexts and spit out this one singular metric. So we publish these results on the internet. You can use it today. You can go through this list to see who are the people influential in the crypto industry worldwide and in different subclusters. But what this is intended to prove is that this quantification is possible. Because if we are right and if this is possible, then another huge piece of our infrastructure can be decentralized and can be made independent of nation-state infrastructure, which means that we can get rid of the dominance of the nation states over us, and instead make them really serve us instead of rule us. Thank you very much.